Hi everyone, I'm Donna Dracunis, and this is one of our bi-weekly Procreate and Tech Tip sessions for Sequential Artist Workshop. We talked about watercolor brushes on our last session, and today we're going to talk more about doing watercolor. And I want to kind of take it a little casual today. So I have a document that Susan sent me that she had posted on the Mighty Network for SAW with some questions about watercolor, working with watercolor digitally in Procreate. And then I have a couple of things of mine in various stages of completion comics that I'll show you things that I like to do in my comics. So let me pin my iPad for everyone, spotlight, and then we will switch to that view. I don't think it worked. Let's see. The host has spotlighted your thing. Did that work? Hey everyone, I don't
still just your beautiful face.
Am I okay? So please go on and pin my iPad. I don't know why it's not spotlighting for everything for everyone.
Now it's blank.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on. So yeah,
it disappeared.
Okay, stop video, start video.
There we go.
Yes.
Okay.
And it's spotlighted.
Okay, so whatever it was not liking it, that fixed it. Okay, so let me know if it goes blank again, but it seems like we're here. So this is my little Procreate collection of things for watercolor. And this is the file that Susan posted, and she had some questions about it, and she sent me the Procreate file so we could take a look at it. So the question here at the top is, how can I get soft irregular edges on these shapes? So I've got some questions for you, Susan, that you can either talk or type in the chat and I'll read what you say. So my question is, these have outlines. Is that just for illustration? You want to make the shapes, if I turn off the outlines, instead of having this hard edge, you want to have a soft edge on those?
That's correct. So yeah, because what I'm looking for is a way to watercolor my comics, the drawings, the objects within them. And I realized I was watching one of the things that Beth had sent about creating a PNG, but if you look at the watermelon on the paint here, you turn the visibility on for the watermelon there at the bottom, and you look over where the bite is taken out of the watermelon, you see how there's irregularity to those edges?
Right.
That's kind of what I'm looking for.
Okay. Did you watch the tutorial for the watermelon?
A long time ago, but
okay.
that would be the obvious.
That, but I'll show you some of the things I would do. Okay.
Thank you.
Is my thing still pinned for you guys?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Yes.
Because I see Susan and different things popping up on mine. So just make sure, as long as you guys see, well, I want to make sure that I have it pinned for the video as well.
It's not pinned for me.
Yeah, it's not pinned for the video. I had to pin it myself.
It was.
I pinned it myself.
Yeah, I pinned it myself too.
But that doesn't work for the video. Good point.
Sometimes you can, if you go to participants as the host, you can spotlight them through the participant list.
Is it working now? I think
Yes.
it is. If it disappears, let me know. Okay, it's asking me on my phone about joining audio, but I'm not going to click anything. I'm going to leave it how it is with the little stupid message up. Okay, so back to this. We want to see how to smooth the edges of these. And so I don't know what brush you use, but it looks like perhaps you filled it by selecting, by by using a reference layer, like if this was a reference layer. So I'm just going to show you some things. Okay, so a lot of times we talk about using a reference layer and then coloring on another layer. So I'm going to turn the coloring off for that. And I've got the layer 9 set as a reference layer. So if I take my select tool on automatic and click inside that shape, it selects just inside that shape. And I go on a blank layer, and let's take a color and a watercolor brush. And when I paint inside that layer, because I'm painting in a selection that has a hard edge from the reference layer, my watercolor there has that hard edge. So if I've done something that way, and sometimes I do this, it seems like a silly fix, but it works. I will take, excuse me, I will take a brush that has a textured edge or a soft brush, airbrush, or a ragged edge, something that has a different kind of edge, and I'll set my eraser to that brush, and then I will pick a size and kind of play around with deleting stuff around the edge. It depends on the brush to how much and how long this will take you. So that is one way. That's one way to do something like that. But you can see that if you're not like me, and I kind of enjoy like tapping on the screen and doing cross hatching exercises in my sketchbooks and stuff like that. If you don't like that, it takes a long time, because if you make your brush too big, then it kind of erases the whole thing and makes a mess. So you're gonna have to take a long time with that. So I don't usually do that on a whole thing. I might do that on the edge of something. What I actually usually do is I don't worry about staying in the lines. So I take a watercolor brush like this, which is this kind of crazy one that's from, I think it's from Brenda Bakker on Skillshare. I got it from one of her classes. It's called her Watercolor Scribble Brush, which I happen to love this brush. And then I pick a color, and then I sort of color within the lines. And I personally could care less if I go out of the lines when I'm doing this. I mean, if I do it too much, I can erase some of it or use liquify to push it back in the lines, or warp or blender brush or whatever. Because I almost always use some kind of blender. Whoops, that was way too big. I didn't want to do that. Some kind of blending in there. So I went out of the lines. If it bothers me in some spots, like I said, I can set my eraser. Whoops, sorry. I can set my eraser to, you know, a smooth brush like monoline or a flatting brush, and I can erase it right to the line if I want to, or I can leave it outside the line. So I do that a lot because I don't care. I mean, in real watercolor, that's what would happen, right? Unless you are really fussy and you work with a teeny tiny, you know, size 2 watercolor brush. So this is like my favorite sizes of watercolor brush. Okay. So that's like I don't know. It's a pretty big mop brush and a medium. I very rarely work with a round that has a really sharp point. So I do stuff like that for real. Now, some people are painting watercolor with a brush like this or even smaller, and it has a really sharp point and it's really tiny, and then they can get something really smooth on the edge like that. Now, of course, this is really rough on the edge, not just a little bit rough. It also depends what brushes you use. And this has to do with the paper texture too. I noticed that this has Calvin from Drifter Studio paper textures in there. And if I turn it on, you can see it, and it changes the colors of the paint and everything. So if you're going to use these, you want to paint with them on so you know what you're getting. But there's also brushes that don't have sharp edges, or that have texture inside them. So this is one of Elisa Bardot's gouache brushes. I don't have her watercolor brushes, so I bet they are really good too. All her brushes I have are really good. This, so I'm using it pretty big, but I can make it smaller. Make it too small. Now, I have the watercolor paper texture on, but if I turn those layers off, you can see that this paint still has the texture in it. And the edge is pretty sharp, but not totally sharp. So you can look in the brush and see what the shape is. If you look at the shape of the brush, you can see how sharp the edge of what you paint will be. And this is a new thing for Procreate 5, that brushes can have two shapes in them and they work together. So I haven't figured out how that works yet, but it's very cool. So basically that's, I don't know how they did it on the particular watermelon thing, but I mess around with the brushes and figure out which ones I have that do sharp edges and don't do sharp edges. See, this one does not have a sharp edge. So even if I make it really small and color in a shape, it's going to have a rough edge. So let's erase that layer, and I can make it pretty small. So whoop, this brush doesn't get as small as I want. So here's something you can know. If you go into a brush, so you open the brushes and you click the brush to pick it, and then you click it again, it brings up this. When you go into the properties, there's no minimum size on this. So I don't know why I can't make it any smaller. It must be the size of the shape she used or something. Usually you can bring that down smaller and make the brush even smaller, but I don't know why that's not working. Something else is going on with this brush. So let's look at these. This is one of the Stoni's watercolor brushes that I use a lot. Where do I have them? Here we are. So just pick a different one. Oh, this is a multicolor one. See, I can make that one get totally small. Huh. Oh, it's got a tilt sensitivity in it. Okay, so that's something to check in the brushes too. So go in the settings here and set the, I think probably Apple Pencil. There's a tilt setting, properties. I don't remember where all these things are. Rotation, count. There's all kinds of settings. I don't remember where the tilt setting is, but now that I know that this brush, this one, this watercolor, whatever that word is that I don't know in German. If I go with the tip, it's quite small. And if I go with the side, it's quite big, which is just like a real brush. So I can go here. And if I want to hold it up more near the edge. And be careful where I'm going. Well, let's turn the line off and see what the edge of that looks like. So that's got a kind of textured edge. And if I turn my paper back on, it's even more a little bit because of the paper setting. So those are kind of what I do with that. And I really like brushes that don't have a hard edge because you can, mess around with them more like that. I'm just scrolling through some. So this is one from Calvin at Drifter Studio in his bonus set. This is a foliage blotting brush. Let's see, I got multiple layers selected. Yeah, select the layer. So see, that one does not have a, now he uses it for certain things, for putting spots on leaves, but it's a nice brush for painting if you want to have a rough edge, because his regular brush he usually uses his abstract round. And that one, did I get abstract round? Yeah. Well, it's not that smooth either when you zoomed in way in like that. But when you're not zoomed in, it looks very smooth on the edge. So be careful with the zooming in too. If you zoom in too far, then it's not going to look like what it looks like when you zoom out or print it. So the abstract round from his has a sharp edge, but his one in the bonus set, it's called foliage blotting brush. You can see even zoomed out, the edge is not smooth. So now there's other things too, like this one's from Stoni's. The one reason I like those is that as you color with them, the different ones, they do different things with the darkness. And like real watercolor, the color will like pool on the outside edge. And as it dries in the middle, a lot of times it gets lighter, and her brushes will do that automatically. As you color with them,
Well, that's
it
pretty
lightens
cool.
up and it leaves some darkness at the edge. This one's not set to color dynamics, so it's changing colors too. But you can see that if you, let me make a darker color. If I make a nice big shape and then keep going in the middle, it gets lighter, it leaves some darkness on the outside. So really the thing with this is playing with brushes. Yeah, so these brushes, so yeah, this blender, this spider blender, I like this a lot to use really small, if I have colors next to each other. So let's take another color here and I'll just put it, you know, let's get a brush that doesn't change color. So take the scribble brush or the abstract round brush. Okay, so see when I'm on the same layer. When I overlap, it's like glazing. If I wet on dry, it doesn't spread. And so in the bonus set, the spider brush that Susan had listed there, or a spidery blender brush from Calvin at Drifter Studios, it makes it look like you did it when it was still a little wet, and the colors, you know how the colors kind of just spread into each other and they give that spidery thing. I try to use it fairly small because I don't want to make like that. I mean, you might want to do that for a special effect, but that's not what happens when you know, paint watercolor wet onto another color. You just get this little bit where one of the colors will run into the other color. And if you know your paints, you'll know which color will run into the other. So you usually don't get it going both ways. Like one color is more, I forgot the word, spreads more than the other color in real watercolor. Because here you can do whatever you want. But I like that for when you do something like this. So here I have a thing I did. And you could see I was really sloppy on this because, like I said, I don't really care. I paint sloppy with big brush, so in my Procreate that's okay. But here in this layer where I have the main colors here for her, if I wanted this to look like I had did it when it was still wet, I could take the spider blender and find wherever I have that blue. Let's just look at this by itself, see, and I can spread the blue into the other color. And you can see here that I used different brushes. This one has a watercolor texture in it. This one didn't, or I went over it so many times that it didn't show up anymore, because that can happen too if you keep coloring over with the same brush. And I don't remember what brushes I used on this. I'm very, very intuitive, or I just pick a brush. I have my favorites that I use all the time, but I don't do what a lot of people do, which keep track of what brushes. I keep track of my ink brushes. I only use a couple ink brushes and the sizes, but for watercolor, I want it to be kind of crazy. So this file includes a painting. So if I look at this, this was a watercolor I did, and then I screwed around with it in Procreate. So this was what it looked like when I brought it in, and it was actually red, and I just dragged colors into it to change it, to make it what I wanted for the background of this particular page. And so it has texture in it because it's a photograph of a piece of watercolor paper. And then I changed the size, and I wanted pink, more pink over there. So I added another layer with pink. I could have just dropped pink into the background, but I liked the way this looked better. And so that's real watercolor. And then I had my characters, and I painted them with watercolor, and I did it in a few layers. So this one with my drawing was the first layer, and I just laid in some colors. And then I don't want to mess things up because I'm afraid I'm going to mess it up. So I added more layers to adjust the colors, and I used, I made them be a clipping mask so the colors would stay wherever the first watercolor layer was. And I wanted to brighten up some of the colors and darken some of the colors. And then I wanted to lighten the whole thing. So I kept playing with the colors in different layers. And the only reason I did it in different layers is because then if I can mess up, I can delete one of the layers. Where, you know, if you do it all in one layer, then you're stuck with it. So that's one I did. This is another one I did kind of the same way. So I started with this, which is, that was the watercolor painting I did. And then I wanted to, like, I had different photographs of it, and I liked the way they looked better. I always photograph my things when they're wet and when they dry, and when they're dry, because they look different. So I messed around with that till I got the background looking how I wanted. And then I drew in my characters. And I had two sets of characters. I had these little characters up here by the house, and the bigger characters having the party at the bottom. And so first I colored these characters with a layer just of brown. And then I decided I want them to be like, it was getting dark out and silhouetted. So I kind of colored them with black, and I put a shadow in. And you can see I wasn't very specific with this because this is my way. Now, if you would have drawn these much more carefully and wanted to color them in much more carefully, that's fine. But that's what I did. It was just two layers. And then this one, I had more layers. So I made sort of like a flat color, but I used a watercolor brush instead of a solid brush. So I colored it in sort of with probably Calvin's water blender, water main one, abstract round brush that makes kind of a smooth thing. And obviously sometimes I make mistakes and color on the wrong layer. So I had added some other colors to it. I didn't care though. So then I added more color and a shadow. And yeah, so I just layered it up till I got what I wanted. And then I wanted her to stand out more in some of the characters. So I drew them in two separate sections. I don't remember exactly why I picked which ones, because it's not like I drew the foreground characters in one layer and the background characters in one layer, but I drew them in a couple of layers. But the reason I did this, instead of doing this as this background layer in brown and watercolor brush, instead of doing it in a solid white, is that I kind of wanted a little bit of the background to show through, and it does here and there. So you know, that's my thing. So let me show you one more, and then we'll do one. I have one here I can like demo. This is another thing I did. It wasn't really supposed to look like watercolor necessarily, but I use watercolor and gouache brushes a lot. So I had put all these layers of snow in because it was a snowy day. And I had started with just a sketch. And the background's gray because it looked better for me with the colors. And I just kept adding. So I wanted to spot in a little black here, but I was afraid to do it on the same layer. So I did these things on different layers so I could turn them on and off again. So I added in some blacks and grays that weren't in the original sketch. And then I added in some color. And you'll notice that the color is underneath the ink, even though I have some large areas of gray and stuff, I still left the color underneath. So I just started coloring it. Then I decided to add more black. And again, you can see like I'm really scribbly here because that's just my style. So I wanted to add more smaller trees and I just went like that. And then I colored the sky. And that's just, again, just a layer with watercolor brushes. And then I added the sunset. And that's just another layer with watercolor brushes. And when you put it all together, it looks really cool. At least I thought it did. Another thing I did, which I'm sure I've showed you before, is I used these effect layers on the top. So I added 2 layers on the top. So this is what my sketch looked like, but I wanted it to look like it was at night. So I added this layer, which is filled with like a navy blue, really dull navy blue. And I set that layer to color for the blending mode. And then I moved it up and down because, you know, as it starts to get dark out at night, the colors fade until everything looks like dark blue and gray. So I did that to give it that effect. And then this other layer, I do this a lot. I add pictures of marbles usually, but it could be anything. I added a layer. You add a layer. This isn't really watercolor, but it can give it a watercolor effect because it makes kind of changes in the colors that looks like watercolor blended. And I insert a photo, and it really doesn't matter what it is. Let's take this, okay? And then I'm going to bring it up and fill the canvas with it. And then I'm going to go into Gaussian blur and blur it. And you can, you know, do it as much or little as you want. I usually go to where I can't really see what it is, but it doesn't turn to pure mush. But, you know, let's just play with it and see. And then you set that to overlay. And it changes the whole picture. And you can, again, adjust the opacity of it. So, you know, some days look really pink like that, especially at the sunrise. And some days are more dark. In fact, this one might look more like sunrise and this one like sunset. But these overlay layers and putting a layer in color blend mode really can change your whole image. And it does give it a watercolor effect to me because you see how it looks kind of like I did a wash either over top of the whole image or on the paper first, because it just looks like I did a crazy little wash. And I've seen this a lot. Felix Scheinberger has it for real watercolor in his book, and sometimes he does it at the beginning and sometimes at the end. It adds a continuity to the whole picture and kind of makes the color scheme tie together more. And let's see, one of the books, one of the authors I read that does watercolor in comics does something, paints all her panels with the pale yellow before she does the other colors to give it a similar all over kind of feeling of warmth. And then you can decide if you want to do that for everything or just day and night kind of thing. So that doesn't use watercolor brushes or anything, but I think it gives a watercolor effect in Procreate to the drawing. So yeah, so I would start with a drawing like this. And if I didn't have a specific background behind it, I just start painting on a layer below. So I locked my layer here because I always draw on the wrong layer if I don't. And underneath my inking layer, I go and I just pick my colors that I want. And I generally stick with this. These are my main palettes. This is for a specific project. This is a Skin and Hair Tones palette I got somewhere that I like a lot. I don't stick exactly with these colors, but it's a good starting point. And this is just a personal palette I made up that I just really like, and I tend to go to it unless I need something that's totally out of there for a specific reason, like purple or orange or something. But this is like my main palette. So I usually like just pick a color like that, and then I usually go into my favorite brushes, where like I said, I do have a few watercolor brushes that I use a lot, and other brushes that are not really watercolor. Like I have this fog brush and this Misc brush that I use for watercoloring, because didn't get it. Fog brush. I think it makes like a watercolor kind of pattern. And I just color this stuff. Like I just color it. And then sometimes I erase, sometimes I blend. But I'm very, I guess I do it more like real watercolor than what some of the people who do demos do. I just paint. Sometimes I forget and I pick up my pen, and then it makes a darker spot and everything. And that just looks like you ran out of paint on the brush and had to start it. And when I go to the blender, I use Calvin's water blender the most. And then I'll like say, oh, I want to blend some of that. And then sometimes I say, okay, I want to, I really wanted to stay in the lines more on that one. So I'll make my eraser smaller. And I really didn't want that to go out of the line. Usually I let it go out on the sides, but say like if I had gotten blue in this guy's hair, I might erase that because I don't want that to go into that. And I just pick colors, and then every now and then, so like for this, what I would probably do is make another layer for the skin tones, and I would separate the clothes and the skin tones, and I can merge them later if I want to use a blender brush and blend them together. But I generally paint, when I'm painting people, I generally paint. See, if you don't switch back from the water blender brush to a different painting brush, you try to paint and nothing happens. If you're doing watercolor, that probably means you're still on a blender brush because there's nothing to blend, so nothing happens. Yeah, and then I just go to another piece of clothing and figure out where the clothing is. See, so here would be a thing. Say I was painting all the clothing together. Okay, so I made a really dark spot. I could undo it, or I can go to my water blender and just tap it a little. And then here is where that other one, I haven't moved this to my favorites yet, but I want to soon. I want to move this spider blender into my favorites or copy it. That's a nice place to add a little bit of that spider blending where the color, where the red like escaped, where the red escaped into the blue. And that's one of those things I love about watercolor. If you accidentally touch something that's white, whoops, if you accidentally touch something that's wet, the color can blend into the other one accidentally. Yeah, and so I generally will probably stick with one brush for the whole thing, like all the clothes. Right now I'm going to duplicate this, so if you swipe left on a brush, you can duplicate it, and then I can hold down on it, come out here, go up to my Donna's Best, my favorite brushes, and I can put it in there right next to the other water blender. So now I have a copy of that in my main brushes. So I usually will either use the abstract round or the scribble brush. I pick one that I like, and I usually do whole picture with it, and then I might add details with another one. And then depending what I'm drawing, I will do different things. So say this guy's hair, I might take a dark gray or a dark brown and fill it kind of smoothly with Calvin's brush. so that it's, this is the abstract round from Calvin at Drifter Studios. It's the one I use a lot for just filling in areas. It's kind of like my flatting brush for watercolor. If I just want to make an area that's kind of filled with color. Yeah, so that when you do duplicate layers of it, it gets kind of dark. And switch to the water blender and kind of tap that out a little. Whoops. So that's okay. And now, so now what I want to do is I want to add texture to this hair because this kid has really curly hair. So I pick an even darker color and then I tap around in it with one of my texture brushes. Now, that went outside the line, so I'll probably erase that. So that's one thing I can do. The other thing I can do is, I'm going to undo that. If I don't want it to go outside the lines now, I can go into this layer and alpha lock it. So then when I add the texture, it'll add a little. But see, because the watercolor layer was not completely solid, you don't get very much. Because alpha lock, this is an interesting thing about alpha lock. So let me show you something really interesting about alpha lock, because you might think you did something wrong. Okay, I'm going to unalpha lock that layer. I'm going to draw 2 circles. Okay, so this circle I'm going to fill with a solid color. I just color dropped in it, or I could have used like a flatting brush to color it in. Okay, so that's really solid. That's really solid. If I go inside this circle and instead of using a really solid brush, I take the abstract round brush and paint in it. This is painting transparently. It's not solid. So if I add a layer below it and draw something else, you can see it through it. Let me pick a different color just so you can see that more clearly. See, you can see that kind of greenish gray line right through the brown. See, it's a layer underneath. But if I go under that one, it's totally solid. Okay, so every pixel on here is solid. That's not the case on here. Every pixel on here is transparent. So if I go to that layer and alpha lock it, and now I pick a nice solid brush and a bright color, if I color on this, you see it shows up really strong because each very solid pixel is picking up very solid color from my brush. On this one, do you see how it's the dark solid pixels become solid yellow, but the transparent pixels become transparent yellow instead of transparent brown. So when you turn on alpha lock, it not only stays within the lines, but it keeps the transparency that that layer had in the way the brushes had worked. So if you had, if you tried alpha lock and you thought you would get something really solid and you got something that didn't really show up, it's probably because the layer you alpha locked is not solid. So that's why this shows up here, because it's a solid brush on a transparent watercolor layer with alpha lock. But if I take a transparent brush, like my abstract round, oh, that one's more, picking up more with alpha lock. And I tried this Misc brush, it doesn't show up that much. So the more transparent your brush is, and the more transparent your layer is with alpha lock, the transparency adds up and it looks like nothing's showing up. You can see it's, as I add more and more layers of the transparent yellow, it's starting to turn yellow. So alpha lock is really interesting. It keeps you within the lines, but it doesn't always give you the exact effect you are expecting, because it's mixing both the solidity versus opacity of the brush you're using and the solidity versus opacity of the brush you used before when you first painted on the layer. Does that make any sense?
Yep.
Anybody have questions about that alpha lock stuff?
Well, where do you put your layer for alpha lock?
No, it's whatever. Okay, so what I did was, this I was coloring on, I just picked the layer. Okay, I said, I'm gonna make a new layer and I'm gonna draw the character's hair on this layer. So I took a brush and kind of filled in their hair with something. And of course, there's all different brushes you can use. You can use a solid brush if you want it to be like a flatting brush. You can use watercolor brushes. And in this case, I was using a watercolor brush. But say on this woman's hair, I will take my flatting brush. And I just made a layer that I said, okay, this is going to be the hair layer. And I'm going to color their hair. And then I wanted to add texture to it. And you can do that with another layer, or you can do it in the same layer with a alpha lock turned on to stay within the lines. So again,
That's
I'm
what I
not,
mean.
yeah.
So with
So here's,
alpha lock
so
turned
I
on.
did the two hairs, and this is my hair layer. And I can rename it to hair layer or whatever, but I know it's my hair layer. So now if I want to add something to the hair, but stay within the lines, I alpha lock the hair layer, then I can change my color and I can pick something to add to it. This is cool. I bought some hair brushes, so I can actually add like curls to her hair like that. And it stays within the lines because I alpha locked it.
Okay.
So you can alpha lock any layer. In this case, I had painted the hair and then I wanted to add more to the hair, but I liked the shape I had. So I didn't want to go outside of the line. So see here, because I had painted this hair with the solid brush, when I apply the curls, it comes out very solid. I painted this hair with sloppy watercolor transparency. When I paint the curls with the same brush, they don't really show up in a solid way because it's this brush, this hair brush, how it interacts with the watercolor brush that I used underneath it. It interacts very solidly with the solid paint I put in there, and it interacts transparently with that. So it's just experimenting, and I just mess around. I spend a lot of time messing around to see how things come out. So I take this brush. Well, that's not, I put alpha lock on, so it's not painting, turn alpha lock off. I take this airbrush and I try it, and then I can go back to say my hairbrush and take the curls and see what happens there. Okay. Now I can turn alpha lock on and say what happens when alpha lock's on. Oh, look at that. It doesn't, this gray is so transparent. And when I paint on it with the hairbrush, they don't interact.
Oh,
So yeah, so really it's just, I spend a lot of time doing stupid things like this, just playing like you did when you were a kid, and learn your tools and try your tools. I mean, I do all kinds of ridiculous stuff, not just with my iPad. I don't know. I mean, I do stuff like this to try out a new pen. I'm never going to use this for anything, but I want to draw thick lines and thin lines and see what happens if I do this with the pen and that. And I do the same thing on my iPad. Yeah. And I think with watercolor on the iPad, just like with real watercolor, you have to really experiment with the brushes that you decide you want to try, and just experiment with them and see, like this brush, does it work better tapping or smut, or spreading the paint like this, or a little bit of both? And I tend to use this brush with a little bit of both because I like kind of how that comes out. But if I'm using this brush, the abstract round, I try to never pick it up because I kind of like how it paints better if I never pick it up. If I pick it up, it makes a lot of hard edges. But if I keep coloring with it like that, it doesn't make all those hard edges. And then there's less to blend. So you just have to play with them, and it takes time, and there's no shortcuts. I mean, you can watch tutorials and see what the artists do, but when you're going to do it, it's going to be your own style. And so you're going to have to change things. So Susan's playing with watercolor backgrounds. Yes. Someone said what I was doing was like a bloom. That reminds me of one other thing. I'm going to go back through the chat in a second, but I want to show you if I can find it. I have so many brushes, and this one isn't in my favorites yet, but this is a cool, there's a cool one that I really like that I have not used a lot yet, but I want to use it more. This one. This is from Shannon Lane. I don't know where I got it, but look at that brush, right? Isn't that cool? So this is one of those things that you can do is I can go to the edge of this and I can, now it depends how big the brush is and which direction I move it in, but I can add like a hard edge that bleeds into the color, or if I go in the other direction, I can add a hard edge that's bleeding off into the paper. Isn't that cool? So that's a brush I'm just learning how to play with because I think it adds some really like realistic watercolor edges to things. And I don't remember where I got it. I don't remember where I got this, but it's from Shannon Lane, Layne. So you could Google it, I'm sure. And yeah, and then there's these other ones that are stamps. Like I said last week, I don't use the stamps that much because every time you stamp it, it's the same and you can't paint with it. See, it just doesn't work. It just does one stamp. And there's a lot of these that you can find, but I don't find them incredibly useful just to, have one stamp. I don't know. There's a lot of them for sale and for free, but I don't use them a lot. But I do love this edge bleed one. And right now I'm going to swipe left and duplicate it and move the copy into my favorite. So I remember to try that more with my watercolors because I really like that. I used it a couple times and things, but yeah.
If you use one of those stamps, can you smudge the stamps?
Oh, sure. You can do anything you want with the stamp brush, just like, so let me go back into that. Where were they? I have too many watercolors. Okay, here's the stamps. Okay, so let's turn everything off and make a new layer and make some stamps, right? So yeah, you can go in, you can use the regular smudging tool, right? You can go into your brushes and pick, one of the watercolor blenders and use that on it. Also remember when you're using the blenders and the watercolor brushes, you can change the transparency of them. So if you're using a watercolor brush and you want it to look like you added more water, turn the transparency down and see if that does anything. Okay, on this brush, not really. It all depends how the person who made the brush set it up. So this one, it does make a difference. See, when I turn the transparency up, it's like a solid gouache brush almost. And when I turn the transparency down, I get this really light watercolor brush. Like I have more water on my brush. So you don't forget, we always use the size change, but I always forget that you can change transparency of your brushes too. So, okay, so the stamps, you can blend them with the blender. You can liquefy them too. So I can go and liquefy, I can, stretch it around, do stuff like that. Then it looks like a whole different thing, right? Like the crystal thing I can put on it, which that almost looks like it's water or ink spreading into paint or ink spreading into water just as you do it, doesn't it? So
Yeah.
liquefy is something you can mess around with everything. Yeah. So yeah, you can take those and then distort them I think Mariah was using some stamp brushes in one of her recent comics, and they weren't watercolor stamps, but she put the stamps on and then she stretched them and liquefied them and did things to them to make it more dynamic in the background. Let's see, got to use a mouse on the thing. So let me look through the chat real quick. So there's a couple of questions about paper and what you do with paper layers. We're going to be spending our whole next session on using special papers in Procreate. And I'm not just going to show you watercolor. I'm going to show you several watercolor papers, but I'm also going to show you some papers I have for gouache and pastels. And so how you can use different papers in Procreate. So that's our whole next session. So so that's what we'll answer those in our next session. Faded edge, Beth says, one way to make a faded edge is overpaint the shape you want, and instead of erasing the edges, you can use a selection tool. So I'm going to take the abstract round and I'm going to make a shape with it. Now, what I can do here is I can take the selection tool with freehand. Thank you, Beth, for reminding me of this. Calvin at Drifter Studios uses the selection tool a lot. And I can select this, tap the dot at the beginning to close it. I can invert it. So now what's selected is the outside, and what's not selected is the inside of the shape. I can feather the edge of the shape, of the selection. So that makes it
Smaller.
blended, not solid. Right. Now that I've feathered my selection, you would swipe down with 3 fingers, but I changed mine to tap with 4 and cut. It deleted the outside where it was selected, and I have a nice smooth edge on that. So that's another way you can do that, yes. So 2 or 3 places you have had good luck buying brushes. I get my brushes from Gumroad or Etsy usually, but Lisa Bardot has her own website, Bardot Brush, B-A-R-D-O-T. She has great brushes, all different kinds. I love her brushes. If you're only gonna buy brushes at one place and you're just starting out, you can't really go wrong with Lisa Bardot's brushes. And she has tutorials for all of them too, and she has sales all the time. So Bardot Brush is good. The other ones I have are from, I get brushes. I had Skillshare for a year, and I got brushes from a lot of my teachers while I had Skillshare. You can get Skillshare if you have never had it before. You can get a sorry, I'm not showing anything. I'm gonna go back to my face, I guess, so we're not just looking at that screen. So you can go back to, you can get a 2-week free trial on Skillshare if you never had it before. And a lot of the classes on Procreate, the teachers provide brushes that they made to go with those classes. So like Brenda Bakker is one that I mentioned today that I was using her brushes. I got them from her Skillshare class. So that's a good place. And then otherwise, it's just I look for artists that I like, and they have brushes that a friend of mine used, or that I saw an artist mention in a Instagram post or something like that. And you don't really need a ton of brushes, so don't worry if you don't have a lot. There's a lot you can use with what comes with Procreate, and there's a lot of free brushes out there, so you don't have to spend a lot of money. Yeah, and then Beth mentioned this ones I said a lot, Calvin at Drifter Studio for watercolor brushes, Lisa Bardot. And I did put a thing in Saw on my favorite watercolor brushes. I posted a post with them. And also if you look up the video from the previous Procreate session on YouTube, in the description, there's links to the list of all my favorite brushes with links. Yeah, that says Retro Supply Company. They're very reliable. I don't have any of their brushes, but they are very respected company, and a lot of comics artists use their brushes. Yeah, can't figure out how to search the topics in SAW. Yeah, don't, it doesn't work very good. So you're not doing anything wrong. You're not doing anything wrong if you can't find stuff in SAW. Yeah, so Taro layer brush, I love that brush. Let me see here. I'm going to see if I can post my favorite brushes, if I still have that saved. Yeah, I do. I'll post it in the chat, and I'll have it put on the description of this one too on YouTube. So those are in the chat, I posted my favorite watercolor brushes. So anyway, that's it for today. To answer some questions from Susan, and just go through some things of how I do watercolor and Procreate. And then we will come back in 2 weeks and do all about paper. So thanks for coming, everyone. And see you
Thank you so
around.
much.
Thank you again.
This was great.
Bye.
Thanks a
Yeah.
lot.
Always
Bye,
great.
everybody.
Mhm.